Fair use and licensing and eras and emissions and release and sales. Oh my. We all feel a little like Dorothy when it comes to the legal side of indie filmmaking, and that is our topic of discussion today. What's up, Brooklyn? Welcome to the Bushwick Film Festival Indie Film Talk on Brooklyn Independent Media. I'm your host, Kwebe, founder and director of the Bushwick Film Festival. I'm sure you've heard of the Cardozo Law School, but did you know about their Indie Film Clinic? The Cardozo Indie Film Clinic is a non-for-profit clinical program that provides free legal services to filmmakers and artists providing services in independent and documentary film. I know, it's insane. I almost fell over when I read about it, and I couldn't wait to share this info with you. Please join me in welcoming David Morrison, Executive Director of the clinic at Cardozo. Thank you for coming to the show.
Thanks for having us.
And two student attorneys, Catherine Leibowitz and Jessica Cohen-Nowak. Thank you for coming on the show. So, let's get right into it. David, can you tell us a little bit more about the founding of the clinic and the motivation behind it?
Sure. So Cardozo has a fairly long tradition in art and entertainment law. And that's also sort of inclusive of intellectual property law. And I was working at Cardozo with former professors now at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. And we had this sort of discussion and idea about a film clinic, a clinical program that would represent local filmmakers in New York. The benefit of that really is that we give students an opportunity to learn some practical skills, to meet with and represent real clients and develop a sense of sort of professional independence. So we thought that it was a smart and relatively easy way to merge the background in intellectual property at Cardozo with a push in law schools generally, and at Cardozo specifically, to open up and broaden the scope of their clinical programs.
Great. And how long did it take you guys to get it off the ground?
So it's it's a long process. I mean, law schools, we worked together on a proposal. We met with, talked to, and reached out to a lot of foundations and nonprofits that work with filmmakers in New York. We were sort of concerned about whether or not we would have a client base that would support the work that we'd be doing. And we pretty quickly found out that didn't really seem to be an issue at all. But in terms of moving the proposal through the administration, that took, I think, something like 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. What are some of the most common issues that indie filmmakers run into or need help with?
Yeah, it can really run the gamut, and Jessica and Catherine both have experience with this. But I think, if you were to really generalize it, I think what we do is help filmmakers work on the contracts, whether they're releases, whether they are license agreements, whether they are employment agreements or engagement agreements, all of the documents that help the filmmaker to prove that they have a clear chain of title in the copyright to the film and that they have the right to exhibit the film, distribute the film, and do all the things that filmmakers want to do after they're done making a film. Separately, anytime a film is picked up for distribution, there are going to be things that the distributor wants to know that you have in place. And those include the contracts that we work on.
All right, we can go further into that, but I just want to head over to Catherine. Fair use and licensing. Can you explain what qualifies as fair use?
Sure. So basically, a copyright owner has exclusive rights to use of their copyright, and so if someone else wants to use a copyrighted work for any reason, you have to get permission through a license, and that can be really expensive, and sometimes copyright owners won't grant a license, and fair use is actually an exception to that rule, and the rationale behind fair use is to allow the public to see protected works and to comment and criticize, maybe for teaching or news reporting. And so there are 4 factors that a court will consider in determining whether a use is fair use. The first use is the purpose and character of the use, and under that analysis you consider whether the use is commercial or if it's a nonprofit use. You would also consider whether the use is transformative, and the best example of that is a parody that we see a lot. And the second factor is the nature of the copyrighted work. So you'd want to consider whether the copyrighted work is something that's creative or expressive, such as a song or a poem, or if it's informational, like a news report. You'd also want to consider whether the copyrighted work was published or unpublished. And the third factor is the amount and substantiality of the portion used versus the copyrighted whole. And so typically fair use favors brevity, but a lot of courts have held that sometimes the entire use of an entire work is fair use. And the last factor is the effect of the use upon the potential market for the copyrighted work. So you'd want to consider whether the new use would have an impact on derivative uses or licenses and that kind of thing. So as a filmmaker, you'd want to consider these 4 factors if you realize that maybe something is captured in your film that might be a protected work.
Wow.
Yeah, it's
okay.
the fair use doctrine is one of these multi-dimensional tests that you see a lot in the law. That's sort of very hard to pin down precisely. And it sort of develops, according to case law in practice. But it's really interesting. Catherine worked on a legal opinion letter on fair use issues for a project last semester.
Okay. And do filmmakers? I mean, is fair use after the fact, or do they approach the actual creator of the work first before the fair use? Like, what is the process?
I guess it can happen before or after, but sometimes if you ask a copyright owner to use their work and they say no, the use can still be fair use.
Okay.
And there's a Supreme Court case where that happened, and they let it be fair use. But I think, sometimes it happens before the film is made, sometimes it happens after, and then you notice that something's protected.
Okay. And another thing that I know that filmmakers get all boggly-eyed about is like errors and omissions. What is it and why is that extremely important?
Well, it sort of builds off of some of what we were just talking about with fair use. First of all, it's an insurance that each filmmaker will want to consider when they're putting together their budget. A distributor is not going to be able to distribute the film without some sort of insurance because they don't want to go into a distribution deal and then find out, oh wait, you don't own all of your content. So one of the things that happens with this fair use discussion when you're going to get errors and omissions insurance, you will give a lawyer, maybe a student lawyer at the Indie Film Clinic, your script or some clips if you have it, or your full film. It depends where you are in the process. And they will go through and say, this you need a license for, or this maybe is fair use, and they will write an opinion letter to that insurance company, and that will help you get insurance. So it sort of all molds together. It's that legal opinion letter is your way into the insurance if you weren't able to get a license. And you also need some other things for the things that you cannot get, for the things that you can get a license for, that insurance company will ask for it. But it gives you sort of a liability away from if something happens where what you think is fair use isn't, or what you think you should have been able to use, and something happens and someone sues you, you will be covered. And your distributors will be covered.
Okay.
Yeah, it's more or less, it's a practical backstop. You get advice from your attorney about what things you need to license, what agreements you need, and the insurance policy provides protection in the event that, despite that advice, a claim is brought in connection with an infringement issue or a defamation claim.
Okay. And most of the filmmakers that come to the clinic, are they aware of this? Or, I mean, what is your caliber of filmmaker? Like, do they show up knowing all these, and do you guys have to do a lot of backtracking? Or are there only just a few things that might be a little off with their project?
It can depend. I mean, we do work with student filmmakers, some of whom are, relatively sophisticated about rights issues and fair use issues, and we also work with professional filmmakers who have done some of this before, or they've worked with an attorney or worked with a producer to bond an E&O policy.
Okay.
But we do occasionally work with filmmakers who are, for one reason or another, are either not quite as familiar or just are entirely uninterested in the legal issues, which from my, in my perspective is totally fine. I think the advantage of having really good advice is that you can spend all of your energy focusing on the creative aspect of the film.
Cool. And I know when you start a film, you're not really thinking, oh my God, I should start a corporation or a business. When should filmmakers establish a corporation or a limited liability company for each of their films? Or, what is something that you would suggest?
So again, it depends. And this is something, if you spend enough time with lawyers, you'll hear a lot. If you're a professional filmmaker, and if you are negotiating with investors, if you're receiving money to produce a film, if you're producing a film specifically with the idea in mind that you're going to release it commercially, distribute it, and do all of those things, that you plan to have sort of a broad platform for the film, at some point it makes it's just an extremely good idea to form some legal entity that will contract on behalf of the film, that will manage and administer the rights in the film, and that will limit your individual liability in the event that there are legal issues. On the other hand, if you're a student filmmaker who's producing a short film for a thesis showcase or some other project that the scope of which is potentially more limited, forming an LLC is not inexpensive. So in those cases, it may not make financial sense to spend $1,600 to form an LLC for a film that you're making for a couple $1,000s. Okay.
So before we go into the next few questions, let's take a quick look at one of the trailers that the clinic has worked on, La Camioneta, directed by Mark Kendall. Did I say that last name right?
Kendall.
Kendall, okay, yeah. Sorry, Mark. And represented by the clinic. Let's take a look at that trailer.
Cuando mueres, pues muere tu cuerpo, pero no muere tu ser. Tu ser como tal, tu energía, sigue estando dentro de todos. Son partes de un cuerpo que siguen viviendo, ¿no? Partes de un ser. Entonces así el bus igual, ¿no? Para mí la vida es un viaje. Todo te lleva. Tú únicamente sabes que vas hacia un lugar incluso muchas veces no conoces ese lugar. Pero sí depende de lo que creas que la vida tiene para ti. Para cada persona.
That was the trailer La Camioneta by Mark Kendall. The film was also on IndieWire's list of top documentaries in 2013. Can you tell me a little bit about the film and what your involvement in it was?
So the documentary itself is about a bus driver from Guatemala who travels regularly to the United States to purchase secondhand school buses. There is a system in Guatemala of sort of quasi-public transportation that involves the use of buses like this that are sort of refurbished, painted. They're made sort of these brightly colored camionetas, and they're all bought at auction in the U.S. because I think most school buses in the U.S. are in very sort of limited circulation after a small handful of years. They can't be in use. So people travel to the U.S., buy them, and take them back. In this case, to Guatemala. So he follows this bus driver from the U.S. to Guatemala, sort of shines a light on some of the social issues in Guatemala connected to what's going on with the bus driver. And it's just it's an amazing film. It's a really sort of a very simple premise that's done just incredibly well. Mark was a student at the School of Visual Arts, a graduate student, when he made the film. He's now a Guggenheim Fellow, making a second documentary. But this is a great project. It's available on iTunes, on Netflix. So if you want to search it out, find it, I would recommend.
You can also find it on the clinic's website.
Right.
So what attracted?
Not the film itself.
Right. Not the film, just information about the film.
Right.
So what attracted you guys to this project?
Well, it's an interesting story. I mean, I think what we try and find are either stories that are interesting for one reason or another, or filmmakers who are doing interesting work. We represent clients pro bono, so we have to consider whether or not we're providing legal services to clients who would otherwise be unable to afford an attorney. So we work on lower budget, independent and documentary films, but within that sort of mission, we're trying to find the most interesting, most sort of compelling films and filmmakers that we can.
Great. Maybe you guys could tackle this next question. It's for Catherine, but feel free to chime in. On our last show, Indie Film Pains, filmmaker Keandra Parks talked about how she had to edit out a few scenes from her film Black Girl in Paris when HBO picked it up. Why must filmmakers pay special attention to products and artwork that might appear in the background of a shot?
For some of the reasons that we talked about, I'm sure someone went through the film and pointed out all of the protected copyrighted works or the protected trademarks and realized that maybe the uses weren't fair use, or maybe it was too risky and they didn't want to risk a lawsuit, or maybe getting a license was too expensive. So a lot of times maybe just cutting it out is the best method.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's also, if there's a likeness of a person, or if it's like a poster of a famous person using their likeness, there's all sorts of claims that they could make if they didn't give permission and if it doesn't qualify under fair use.
Okay.
And so there's certain things, especially when it's a trademark, when it's a brand, they, depending how they're depicted or where, they might not be okay with it being in the background. A lot of times if it's really just a background thing, then it would probably qualify as fair use, but it really depends. So that's why it's important to find out in the beginning, or at least get a reliable legal opinion about it before you get to that point.
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned that you guys look at scripts and go through it and see what needs to be done. Do you guys also look at films and comb through the images of the films and do the same thing pretty much?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So how long does the program services last? Is it, do you jump on at a certain point and hop off after like a month or two, or do filmmakers come to you and you have like an 8-month to a year sort of process with them? I don't know if,
the filmmakers are with the clinic for as long as they need the services.
Okay.
So sometimes the scope of the services might change if the project has changed. The student attorneys, like Catherine and myself, are only there for a semester. So we worked on it for a semester, but our previous clients are still with the clinic. So if there are still ongoing issues, and they will, David's there throughout the summer, for example, when the semester, there isn't a semester, so there's no student attorneys, but, and then there will be new student attorneys in the fall, and they will have a new group of people to work with.
Okay, cool. And question about any resources. Do you guys have any, could you recommend any programs or resources online or books that filmmakers could look into that doesn't necessarily need to be handled by a lawyer or a clinic?
Right. So yes, short answer. I want to say, kind of preface that by saying any specific legal question is sort of beyond, potentially beyond the scope of a template contract or an entertainment law book. If there are circumstances that are unique to what you're doing, you want to be able to identify those and sort of deal with them. And in some cases, that means that you may want to talk to an attorney. But having said that, there are good form contract books. Michael Donaldson is a copyright attorney in Los Angeles who does an incredible amount of work in independent film and with documentary filmmakers. And he's published a contract book. The title is escaping me, but if you look him up, he has a firm website. His books are going to be linked through that website. What is the book that we assigned? Right,
Thomas
so Litwack, Mark Litwack also publishes an entertainment law contract textbook. And so those are good sources to go to try and find things that would give you sort of an example. And if you're really only looking for releases, you can find good releases outside of a law firm.
Okay.
Right. In terms of general legal questions, I think both of those books are directed primarily to contracts, but they may discuss some of the underlying legal issues a bit. I'm not
Yeah, I think they're a little bit more
focused on the contract.
for lawyers that are
Are they?
going into the field. But Thomas's book is like, there's a Thomas Crowell who's also involved in the clinic. He's a supervising attorney. He wrote, I don't know if someone else wrote it with him, but it's and I'm now not going to remember the title, but it's, I think, like a filmmaker's guide to law or the reverse of that. I believe he has a website as well. But it outlines all of sort of the major issues from sort of the start of the filmmaking process to the end, and explains a lot of, the legal jargon that is, a filmmaker will be getting in different contracts. But again, like David said, it shouldn't be used in place of legal advice. It might just be a good thing to reference. Like there's a chapter, I think, for example, that sort of explains the copyright issues and what fair use is.
Got it. Okay, that sounds great. We have a few more minutes left, but I do want to tell filmmakers how they can apply to the clinic and what the process is if you want to start.
I think that's probably, I think that they send a general inquiry first, right, to the email.
Yeah.
Right. Usually what happens, you can find us on the Cardozo website. The more information we get sort of in advance of a meeting, the better off we are. So usually a pitch book, projected budget, some information about the filmmakers. And then from there, we have a phone call. We talk about the legal issues a bit, and then we ask them to come in to the law school to meet with some of the student attorneys, talk about stuff in more detail, set out the scope of the services that were available to provide, and then we go from there.
I should have answered that question, right?
Right? Yeah.
I didn't mention that the Bushwick Film Festival was one of the clinic's clients, so I could have totally nailed that one for you. I would ask David one last question to you. Do you, or to all of you guys actually, keeping in mind there's 3 minutes left, do you find yourself a vital part of the art form in this increasingly legal restricted marketplace?
Art form, no.
No,
I
okay.
mean, hopefully, if we're able to give filmmakers an opinion that allows them to make use of copyrighted material that they would have otherwise cut out of the film, in that sense, we may have some sort of incidental impact on what is in the film itself, but we are very sort of specifically not not trying to be involved in the artistic aspects of the work. But it's part of what's exciting about working on films is just seeing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
How do you guys feel about being involved in the filmmaking process as lawyers?
It's great.
It's great. I mean, there's definitely more of a business side. I mean, we're more involved in the business and transactional side, but I think in regards, at least to the intellectual property, if there feels like a roadblock for the filmmaker where what they want to do with certain content or what they want to do with the film, and being able to give them a good alternative or some advice on where to go lets us sort of feel like we're part of the art form process. But we're not really giving any creative advice because leave it to the artist to do that.
David, can you name 2 other films that the clinic has helped? And do you consider how good the story is when making a decision?
Yeah, so we have 2 films that were sort of recently screened or released. One of them, Broken Heartland, is a documentary filmed in Norman, Oklahoma, about gay and LGBTQ issues in sort of these rural communities in the Midwest. That screened recently on PBS as part of the America Reframed series. We had another film, a narrative film, that's going to be screening this summer as part of the Rooftop Films Festival. And it should have a theatrical release in New York at some time, a bit later in the fall, but I think it's screening Rooftop Films in August. We do consider whether we're interested in the films, when we take them on. I mean, that's not really our primary purpose, but yeah, absolutely, we try and represent things that are creatively interesting, that take on social issues and those sorts of things.
I didn't ask this, but how many projects do you guys take on a year?
I think it depends on how many of our current clients have a lot of need, because sometimes you could have a lot of clients, they don't need anything. You did their transactional work and they're shooting and they won't need us for 8 months unless there's a few things with releases or whatever. So that's something that can be taken care of in a day. But so it depends basically on that. So I don't think there's like a real number, right?
Yeah, if I were to estimate, I think we probably take on at least 10 new projects a year.
A year, okay.
Some of those, as Catherine mentioned, a lot of stuff is ongoing. Or Jessica, you were talking about this. We roll clients over from semester to semester. Yeah.
Cool. Well, so it looks like our time's up. I hope that you were able to get some helpful legal advice and ease the fear around the legal side of indie filmmaking. Make sure to look in some of the recommended resources on the show today and visit the Cardozo Indie Film Clinic to apply. Finally, check out these 3 fantastic films that the clinic helped support: La Camioneta, Broken Heartland, and She's Lost Control, which can be found on the website. Warm thank you to our guests for joining us and taking the time to come, even though you have the bar in 12 days. And to you for tuning into the Indie Film Talk on Brooklyn Independent Media. Thank you so much.